Thank you, and hello everyone. It's nice to be here today. I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I'd like to acknowledge their care for this country as the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to congratulate Wurundjeri Woiwurrung's NARRP team, who were winners of the Indigenous Land Management Award at last night's awards. Great recognition. I can't see you all, but that's fantastic. I hope some of you are there. Great recognition of the fantastic work that team's doing. So my name's Julie Edwards. I work in the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and I've worked on the Victorian Landcare program since 2014. It's a busy space, exciting and always interesting, with lots of new ideas and new initiatives, and hopefully keeping some of the same old things that are standard continuing good practice. So Jackson Chatfield was going to be making this presentation to you today in person, but unfortunately he's unable to be here due to the very sad loss of an elder and auntie in the community. And our thoughts are with Jackson and with the community at this time. So I'd like to acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting today is Jackson's, and it represents his strategic thinking and delivery that has evolved over the last 5 years that Jackson's been the statewide Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator in Victoria. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a bit of a story about our journey in Victoria and the evolution of Aboriginal engagement, inclusion, participation in landcare, and the shift towards enabling self-determination. It's important work and thinking that's evolved really over the last 10 years, and while I'm not the expert, I hope I can represent this work on behalf of Jackson and the other Aboriginal Landcare facilitators that have come before him. So the Victorian Government supports landcare through the Victorian Landcare program, and the program has been supporting engagement between landcare and traditional owners and First Nations communities for more than 10 years. We've learnt a lot along the way, and the approach has evolved over that time, and we wanted to share some of those learnings with you and some of that story. And throughout the presentation, you'll notice there's different terminology used to describe traditional owners, Aboriginal people, First Nations and Indigenous people. And I guess language has changed over time, with First Nations becoming a more inclusive way to refer to community and a more popular way of referring to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. First Nations representing all Indigenous people as the first people, traditional owners of country. However, when speaking about a particular geographic area, traditional owners are exclusively acknowledged for that area and are the only people that can speak for that area. So self-determination, what is it? It's, I guess, all about choice, and for Aboriginal people to be able to determine their future and what they want to do and how they want to do it, and having the resources to get it done. In the last few years, the Victorian Government has made a strong commitment to supporting Aboriginal self-determination. And self-determination is the guiding principle that has underpinned Jackson's work in Landcare and in his role as the Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator in Victoria. How can we support traditional owners and First Nations people to achieve their aspirations for country and people and culture and create positive change? And how does this relate to Landcare? So first, I'll just go back a bit, some background and some history to our journey. How did the Victorian Landcare program get started in supporting Aboriginal participation and engagement? Well, in 2004, only 12% of Victorian Landcare groups had ever engaged with traditional owners. And also in 2004, the first Indigenous facilitator was employed by a catchment management authority to increase Aboriginal participation in natural resource management in Victoria. And I think at the time that was a Commonwealth funded role. And then over the following 3 years, across the 10 CMAs, there were more Indigenous facilitators employed who formed the Indigenous Facilitators Network. And in 2007, that network raised the issue of the lack of Aboriginal involvement in Landcare with the Victorian Government. And in response to those concerns, the then Department of Sustainability and Environment commissioned a review of Aboriginal involvement in Landcare. And that review was the Finding Common Ground review. Just adjust. So the Finding Common Ground review was undertaken in 2010, 12 years ago, and a lot has changed, but a lot of the findings and recommendations are still very relevant today. Is that the 5-minute sign? Goodness. 11 recommendations were made in the Finding Common Ground review, and many are still relevant. Those being two-way communication could be improved between Aboriginal people and Landcare, and opportunities arise where there are common interests and shared activities that can be identified. Funding is needed to make this happen and to support Aboriginal participation in Landcare. There's a lack of awareness of understanding of Aboriginal cultural heritage legislation. Thanks for the clarification. 10 minutes, great. Uncertainty about what to do and who's responsible for Aboriginal cultural heritage protection. And regions with Aboriginal facilitators have higher engagement. And of course, ongoing engagement is critical for good results. So this shows the 11 recommendations from that review. I won't go through them all, but in response to recommendation 2, which was to establish a conduit position to support engagement, the first Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator position was created in 2010. And that position was based in the Northeast Catchment Management area and was employed to support the formation of Aboriginal Landcare groups in that region. That then shifted in 2013, the first statewide Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator was appointed, replacing the regional facilitator and shifting the focus towards supporting groups across the state with Aboriginal cultural heritage training. In 2017, the role was brought into the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Jackson Chatfield was appointed and has been the statewide Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator since then until earlier this year. The statewide Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator role is a big job. It's with many important objectives and many people looking to work with and be supported by that position. Jackson has done a lot of really great work in that role across a lot of areas, increasing participation of Aboriginal people in Landcare, building Aboriginal cultural heritage capacity within Landcare, creating a guide to help Landcare groups, and improving engagement between Landcare and Aboriginal community. From those early origins of the position, there's been a shift towards a statewide Aboriginal cultural awareness in the Landcare community, cultural safety, and supporting Landcare groups to engage with traditional owners. And then more recently, these are some of the activities that have been delivered over the last 5 years or so, including on-country meetings with traditional owners, Landcare facilitators, yarns on farms, walking on country with traditional owners, facilitators and landholders, the preparation of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Guide, which I mentioned, to support landcare and environmental volunteering groups, cultural heritage events and awareness activities with landcare in schools. However, it also needs to be acknowledged that over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of challenges due to COVID, with everything moving online and not as much on-country work taking place, unfortunately. As in Jackson's words, that's where the magic is, getting out on country and talking. These activities have provided great learnings which are guiding the next phase of the program and service delivery to not only increase Aboriginal participation in landcare, but to enable self-determination and to have traditional owner and Aboriginal groups lead the way, with us being here to support their aspirations within landcare. And the next exciting phase of this journey is a 4-year Landcare for Country pilot program, which has just been formally announced last week, but which has been in the planning for a couple of years, probably at least. The Landcare, it's guided strongly by a self-determination approach. The Landcare for Country pilot will provide 4 years of funding to 4 traditional owner First Nations organisations in Victoria to support First Nations and traditional owner aspirations for country and people, and test different ways of First Nations communities strengthening connections with landcare to care for country. Also, really importantly, it will support First Nations employment, skill development and training, and economic development opportunities, and deliver caring for country projects and activities. Some of the initial activities that are planned by those organisations include cultural burning, creation of Indigenous work crews, establishment of native nursery, cultural mapping, more yarns on farms activities and similar. So taking a step in a different direction, what can we all do, and how can Landcare support and strengthen connections with First Nations and traditional owners? There are many, many resources out there, and different groups are at different stages in this journey. What can your group do? I guess some of the things to start that journey are to find out initially who the traditional owners are in your area and other Aboriginal community organisations. Read the Traditional Owner Country Plan for your area. It's a great way of finding out what their interests are and identifying areas of common interest that you can use as a starting point for joint projects. Helping to identify and protect Aboriginal cultural heritage in your area. Looking for opportunities for traditional owners and First Nations groups to connect with country, inviting their involvement in your activities, sharing knowledge, walking on country together, providing upfront and early opportunities for traditional owner input to projects, and also thinking about providing a budget for this. Establishing and maintaining relationships and keeping traditional owners and First Nations community groups informed. Taking the time to listen and share knowledge is really important, and building those relationships builds respect and understanding. And it can be a really rewarding experience for both Aboriginal communities and landcare groups. So this slide shows some of the, for those of you working in Victoria, and apologies to others, this slide shows some of the key resources in Victoria. And I think that these presentations are being shared, so you'll be able to access this and click on these links to access these documents. Otherwise, I'm really happy to share those to anyone who would like them. There's links to all of the Traditional Owner Country Plans in Victoria and the First Peoples State Relations webpage, which has a mountain of resources. There's also a link to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Guide, which Jackson's prepared, and some other really useful resources. And that is the end of my formal presentation. I'm very happy to take questions, comments, and any I can't answer to get back to you and after talking to Jackson about those.
I'll just bring the mic up the front. Here we go.
Great. First, I want to say thanks so much for your presentation. I'm Joy from Tasmania. I had a question in regards to how you were saying that in Victoria you're working towards greater self-determination, such as with cultural burning. And I was just wondering on what land this is being done on. So because
Yeah.
I'm guessing like you're from, I don't know if you have land as part of the organisation that you work for. Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, yeah. Look, it's a good question, and yeah, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning that I'm with does have we do have a lot of land, Crown land that we manage, and certainly across the organisation and particularly in the regional teams, there's a lot of work happening on cultural burning on public land that we manage, and also with Parks Victoria that manage the national park areas. We've also, I mean, a lot of the land care work obviously involves private land, and yeah, there's a lot of interest across those 4 pilot groups that I mentioned, but also other groups in other parts of the state. And we've been working through some of the issues around insurance and yeah, which is appropriate agencies to work with. So we have the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, and where they're interested in working and what type of burning they're interested in doing. So yeah, I guess it would be fair to say on private land it's probably a little bit more complex, but we're really hopeful of being able to get a good program of activities supported and insurance to underpin those. Landcare Victoria Inc., which is the peak body in Victoria, is working really closely on that insurance issue particularly.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I've got 2 questions. I'm from New South Wales, so I need a bit of background. In your presentation, you covered a Build Aboriginal Culture Heritage Guide, which
Yeah,
I assume to be a document.
yeah,
And you also talked about a traditional, it looks like, owner's country plan. Now, I assume that is also an instrument that is created. Is that when I see traditional owners, I'm assuming it's um, I've never heard of such a thing. What is a traditional owner's country plan? And could you give some little background as to how you created a Aboriginal culture heritage guide? Because that sounds fascinating.
yeah, sure. So I've just flicked back to that previous slide. Hopefully you can see that. So the traditional owner country plan. So in Victoria, there's 11 recognised traditional owners, and most, not all, but most of those have their own country plan. So that's what I was referring to by traditional owner country plans, that's their plan for their country and for the caring for country activities that they want to undertake in their area. So it will be, I imagine there will be something similar for a lot of the traditional owners in New South Wales have as well. And it's a really, really useful way of being able to find out a bit about the traditional owner aspirations in your area before you start engaging with them, so that you've got some understanding of what what activities they're interested in and what might align to the activities that you're planning and are interested in. Then on the cultural heritage guide, I can certainly send that to you. It is specific to Victoria, and it's a really great resource that Jackson put together a few years ago now to support landcare groups to understand what their obligations are in projects, in any projects that they're undertaking, what the tools are that they can use to find out about cultural heritage that's been identified in their area, or that where they might need to be really aware of cultural heritage that might exist that hasn't been identified, and what they need to do if they find something, or if they're undertaking, and it's more for the really high intensity activities, which generally is not going to be most of what Landcare does, but for higher intensity activities where they might need to go through a process and approval and investigation before they start work. So that is, the legislation is specific to Victoria, but I mean, it's probably useful to have a look at in terms of what needs to be thought about when you're doing work on country and being aware of cultural heritage. The other guide, actually, which there's a link to there, is the Parks Victoria Aboriginal Heritage Identification Guide, which is a really great guide about the types of cultural heritage that might exist in the landscape that you might not be aware of, and how to identify them. And we've had some examples of some of the landcare networks in Victoria identifying things like scar trees and other cultural heritage that hadn't yet been recorded. So that's another really valuable thing that landholders and landcare groups can get involved in. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, my name is George Savika, so I'm from the Torres Strait Islands. You mentioned about the Indigenous Facilitator. How did you or the group branch out to other Indigenous facilitators? Was it made to branch out, or did you just ask, or was it just something that came naturally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure 100%. I think it was probably something that evolved over time, and obviously, I know when Jackson started in the role, when the role was in our organisation in DELP, it certainly those Indigenous facilitators that were working across the state were really keen to connect with Jackson and support him in his role, as this, being in a statewide position is a challenging position. Sort of, you can get demands from all directions and have to decide what to focus on. At one stage in Victoria, there was an Indigenous facilitator funded in each of the catchment management regions, and they were Commonwealth funded positions, and they did have a formal network where they organised fantastic get-togethers, sort of 2 to 3 day get-togethers in different regions to support each other and to see, sort of share knowledge and activities. But there's no longer an Indigenous facilitator in each region. There are still in some regions, and yeah, so that network has sort of waxed and waned a little bit in how strong it is and how often they come together. But yeah, it has been a really valuable network.
Yeah, because I'm a facilitator, so in the Torres Strait, and if I wanted other people to be part or to do other facilitations, like, for example, if I wanted to facilitate for the Eastern Island cluster, and one for the Central Island cluster, and one for the top Western cluster, it's easier for them because they just look after the cluster compared to myself having to travel around all those islands, which I don't mind. But traveling around to all those islands, it's just much easier for them to facilitate that region. So I understand what you're saying about, because our governing body is a Commonwealth body, and we have answers that we have to, we have to answer the questions that they're providing us. So I understand what you're saying, but yeah, it is a bit hard, but I'm just sort of trying to look at those sort of things. Thank you.
Yeah, and I understand, like, certainly from understanding and seeing Jackson's experience of being in that statewide Aboriginal Landcare Facilitator role, it's really demanding, and there can be a mismatch between the sort of what the organisation at the state or the Commonwealth, in your case, level expects, and what's really going to provide good outcomes on the ground, and you know what really works in terms of making things happen, and getting out, as you said, traveling, getting out on country and having those conversations with people face to face and on country is so valuable. And I think certainly our department's gone through a big learning curve over the last few years about how to support Aboriginal people working in the department and how to best, I guess, support Aboriginal self-determination, but also by not putting too much burden on Aboriginal staff members or on traditional owner groups as well. That it can be that people start getting interested and then they're getting bombarded from every direction with requests to be involved or to provide feedback or to come to meetings and have to be engaged in discussions, which it's great to have that interest and passion, but we also have to be mindful of the burden that it places on people in those roles and those traditional owner groups as well.
I'm afraid, but I think we've got the contact details there to follow up if you'd like. And I'd just like to reiterate the great work that Jackson's done in Victoria in leading the charge with engagement with Landcare groups too. It's been wonderful to watch the last couple of years.